With the Republic being succeeded by the Empire in Star Wars and the CIS having fought to separate themselves from the Republic, it's natural to assume that the Separatist holdouts formed a significant portion of what would eventually become the Rebel Alliance. But in reality, the relationship between the Separatists and the Rebels was much more complicated. We'll primarily be focusing on the Legends continuity, but this is something highlighted in the new canon as well, particularly in Andor, where a scene between Saw Gerrera and Luthen Rael on Segramilo very explicitly lays out these conflicts between groups, which, on the surface, seem to have aligned goals or interests.
Krieger's a separatist. Marpes, a neo-republican. The Gorman Front, the partisan alliance, sectorist, human cultist, galaxy partitionist. They're lost. All of them lost.
That first bit about the neo-republicans and separatists, aside from mirroring the lack of progress certain real-world political groups are able to achieve on areas of common ground due to infighting, is at the crux of today's topic. While the rebellion, also known as the Alliance to Restore the Republic, wanted to oppose the Empire in the same way the Separatist holdouts may have, you have a core conflict remaining, that one group, as the name implies, wanted to restore the Republic to what it once was, while others still opposed that government too. Each of these primary affiliations, whether Rebel, CIS, or Imperial, also had their own subgroups or motivations for their alignment, and the way those could interact would also change with time. In the earliest days of the Empire, while the Clone Wars were officially over, the war against the Separatists remained ongoing. Several of the institutions providing primary backing for the Separatist war machine, like the Trade Federation and Banking Clan, had begun to be dissolved or nationalized, but assets in former Separatist territory remained, and some continued the fighting. Gizor Delso, a Geonosian separatist, attempted to create a new army by reactivating a factory on Mustafar, while Tunbuk Tura, senator of Sai Mirth, maintained a large fleet and also large territory with which she continued the fight against the Empire until the Battle of Tressamine, where her flagship Defiance's banner was destroyed by an Imperial force led by Imperial Admirals Adder Talon and Yando Donna, names you may recognize as future stars within the Rebel Alliance and then New Republic's military. These campaigns, along with others like the Western Reaches campaign, quickly wiped out most of the large groups which at least thought they could openly oppose the Empire, and should have acted as a warning to the rebels on the type of organization which really just couldn't work against the Empire. So while the CIS's holdouts may have represented the most organized and earliest military resistance to the Empire, it's not really something you could point to as an early version of, or even progenitor of the Rebel Alliance organization as we'd come to know it. At this point, while the fighting against the CIS was ongoing and enjoyed massive popular support, the key rebel political leaders like Garmbal Iblis of Corellia, Bail Organa of Alderaan, and of course Mon Mothma of Chandrilla remained as effectively loyal opposition, hoping they could just reverse some of the political changes made by Palpatine. The cut Delegation of 2000 scene in Revenge of the Sith, where some of these senators are organizing to oppose him before the declaration of the New Order, highlights these goals. They make it clear they are not separatists. What they want is for the Republic to return to what it was before. Some were willing to sign a peace treaty with the separatists during the war, possibly allowing them to exist as a separate government, but their goals weren't seen as overlapping, and military action wasn't yet seen as the way to go by most of them. In some cases, core local militias, which would become part of the Rebel Alliance, would have been fighting at least nominally with the Empire at this point, even if some would soon turn against them. Groups like Saw Gerrera's Onderon militia played a much smaller role in Legends, but they're probably one of the most fleshed out examples of groups which would go on to oppose the Empire later, but which found supporting any of the CIS's goals as a political organization equally unconscionable. In some places, like the Atrevis sector, these differences would mean a three-front war even at the height of the rebellion, with open conflict between the Empire, Rebellion, and CIS holdouts. These were still very distinct groups with very different goals. It wouldn't be until 2 BBY, or 2 years before the Battle of Yavin, that the Rebel Alliance officially formed, with both Mon Mothma's declaration of rebellion and the Corellian Treaty occurring that year, uniting 3 of the largest rebel cells under the command of Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Garmbal Iblis within a unified command structure. Oh, and of course Galen Marek, Vader's secret apprentice and former Jedi Rom Kota's militia for some reason. The declaration of rebellion was followed by the fledgling Rebel Alliance swelling with support from planets openly and directly joining them, having learned nothing from the rapid failure of the CIS holdouts, which had a much better organized military and even more industrial capacity, and which had been fighting an Imperial Navy with a decade and a half less buildup behind it. So this, as you may be able to tell, was not the greatest idea in the world. What followed was called Operation Domino, where these so-called secession worlds were brutally put down, showing the Rebel Alliance the need to organize and operate more covertly. Smaller networks of local resistances were put together, while each group would also contribute towards a central rebel fleet, and all communication was done through secret messages they could only access by liking this video and subscribing for more. Mon Mothma even somehow hoped they'd be able to reach 60,000 subscribers by the end of the year, I don't know. But as the Rebel Alliance was more solidified and formalized, Mon Mothma was made Chief of State, and this is where we see the biggest political impacts of the Rebel and Separatist splits. It was crucial for Mon Mothma's purposes that the rebellion not be seen as simply another CIS, or a separate movement more generally. The Empire's best weapon against the rebels was painting them as being separatists, indicated by their labeling of the secession worlds, so the rebel supporters were planets that wanted to leave the Empire, not return the Republic. The rebellion's best weapon was their ability to gain political legitimacy by painting the Empire as the ones who had abandoned shared political values like the democratic institutions of the Republic. To differentiate themselves as much as possible, the rebellion even avoided setting up a full government, as, quote, though few remembered it, the Confederacy of Independent Systems had a representative government, one rendered all but superfluous by the separatist hierarchy that prosecuted the war. A toothless shadow republic would only remind the galaxy's citizens of the Confederacy, and a declaration of a separate government would acknowledge the Empire as a legitimate state, instead of treating it as an illegal and immoral perversion of the Republic, end quote. But even with these goals set from on high, in practice, much of the Rebel Alliance, even among its official membership, were more interested in getting away from the Empire than in actually restoring the Republic, and they expected, or at least hoped, they would be allowed to remain outside the influence of whatever government followed the Empire, believing they may have more leverage within a Republic than under the Empire's oppression. While these were separatists in all but prior affiliation, it was the former members of the CIS itself which became the biggest sticking point. Mon Mothma, Garm Bel Iblis, and Bail Organa, the primary political leaders of the Alliance, all had somewhat differing views on this issue. Bel Iblis and Organa were almost diametrically opposed, with Bel Iblis wanting to allow all but those who had committed war crimes under the Confederacy to enter. And this sympathy for the Separatists fits somewhat within his own Corellian sector's relatively unique powers to remain less under Republic control than the Republic in the first place. While they were technically still aligned with the Republic, Corellia had the power to effectively sit out the war. Organa, as probably the one who had been most of an insider in the Republic and supported a more centralized government, felt that the Republic's restoration was the key goal to highlight, and that any separatism was too much to tolerate. Mon Mothma was somewhat in the middle, acknowledging that they needed all the support they could get, but she was more afraid of the optics of being helped by separatists than anything else. Notably, Garm was also the most militarily oriented of the three, so his concern being for the higher recruitment makes sense here as well. Corellia's reputation had always allowed Garm to be a bit curmudgeonly, even opposing Palpatine openly in ways that other senators couldn't, so the word optics probably isn't in his dictionary in the first place. And ultimately, I think this is where there's the biggest need to highlight some of the divisions within the CIS as well, something I did a bit in my Politics of the CIS video. There were the mega corporations and the institutions which ran the CIS on one hand, and then there were the local militia and proxy groups fighting on behalf of the CIS in most of the battles, but which largely aren't representative of the CIS as a whole, and each of these groups ended up being treated differently. The megacorporations and their remnants seemed to be the area with the most pushback when it came to associating with the rebels. Military hardware would gladly be bought up and used regardless of provenance, with mentions of the CIS's recusant and overhauled munificence being used within the Rebel Alliance, and even some of the larger ships like the Rebel 1, a modified Providence, and the Fortressa, a Lucrehulk-class carrier being used by the rebels until it was destroyed by the Death Star at the Battle of Harutz. But this wasn't as much of an optics issue as you might expect. Few people ever actually saw a rebel fleet in action, so it didn't really matter if they were using the former symbols of the CIS. And the Empire, along with its client states, were similarly happy to use CIS hardware where affordable. The Corporate Sector Authority regularly deployed recusants seized from the CIS and sold off to them by the Empire, and the Empire itself regularly stationed battle droids like the Dwarf Spider Droid alongside stormtroopers at checkpoints in places far more visible to the public. This became even more true after Endor when they were really strapped for resources. But crews and the organizational structures which came with them were often the bigger issue. Several munificents came with their separatist crews intact from the CIS holdouts, despite the long gap between the Clone Wars and the formal organization of the rebel military. But when the holdouts themselves tried to join effectively as organized CIS subgroups operating as rebel cells, they were sometimes turned away. A Neimoidian named Blox Hatha of the Trade Defense Force was denied formal rebel membership, presumably because the organization he brought with him was too much in line with the Trade Federation itself. On the other hand, lower-level organized CIS subgroups would sometimes be let in wholesale. The Brick Sector forces of Horn Ambigene were allowed to join as their own cell, despite Ambigene having been appointed by Dooku himself as the commander of organic training on Byzantius. Though notably, this is a role which emphasized local resistance training against Republic forces, aligning more closely with what the Rebellion was doing than what someone like Blox Hatha, a direct representative of the Trade Federation in the past, probably wanted. So the way these local resistances played out their relationship with the Rebellion were always fairly ad hoc and somewhat complicated in some cases. The Gran of Kinyon, their original home planet, had close ties with the Trade Federation, especially after their senator, Karis, was assassinated and pressure was applied from the Gran of Malastare, one of their colonies, who prevented Karis from getting a replacement by pointing out to the Senate that Kinyon had closer ties to the Separatists. So Kinyon was somewhat forced into a Separatist alignment there. The planet quickly surrendered to the Empire and became a staging ground for attacks on other holdouts after the Clone Wars. But despite this association with the CIS, when the Empire became more heavy-handed in their approach to the planet, destroying a city named Malfi, many Kinyon-based Gran joined or covertly aided the Rebel Alliance without their former CIS affiliation becoming a problem. The Corran are perhaps an even more clear example of where these hard lines were blurred. The Corran were one of two species native to Dak, also known as Mon Cala or Mon Calamari, the other species being the Mon Calamari themselves. After a history of unequal relations with the Mon Calamari, up to and including the Corran's enslavement, the Corran sided with the CIS, primarily with the goal of overthrowing their planetary partners. But this went far beyond just supporting in local skirmishes. Corran organizations like the Corran Isolation League and the heavily Corran-free Dak Volunteers Engineering Corps on Pamont were a major part of separatist shipbuilding efforts during the war, contributing designs like the Providence and even the Subjugator. When the Empire rose and reprisals were exacted against the Republic's enemies, the Corran were near the top of that list. In the ensuing assault against Mon Calamari, the Mon Calamari king Li Char was killed, and both the Corran and Mon Calamari were enslaved. Covert resistance built up, coordinated by the former rivals, and when the planet approached the rebellion, it was as a united front, represented by both the Republic supporting Mon Calamari and the formerly separatist Corran. Akbar, a Mon Calamari himself, became the supreme commander of the rebel fleet, with the Corran not really receiving the credit they deserve for their own role once again, but ultimately their CIS affiliation, despite how closely aligned they were, didn't mean an automatic exclusion. So ultimately, where does that leave us for the relationship between the CIS and the Republic? We've seen the biggest factors come down to why a group was fighting for the Separatists, what they hoped to gain from the rebellion, even just the time period. I think painting the CIS holdouts in the early war as a proto-rebellion doesn't really make sense based on what we've discussed today, and it's only when the top-level influence of the mega-corporations gets shut down that we see any real willingness to allow the former CIS members in, at least openly. There was still some covert cooperation, even with individuals like the aforementioned Blox Hatha, who wasn't allowed actually in the alliance. The more you were aligned with local resistance, even if that resistance was separatist-aligned in the Clone Wars, the more willing the Rebel Alliance was willing to create official ties. But the more you represented the CIS as a separate galactic-level government, the less the Rebel Alliance was comfortable with it, especially if those goals were maintained. So the Rebel relationship with the CIS was more complicated than just no CIS allowed, especially since that would probably get Elon angry at them. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. If so, please consider leaving a like or subscribing for more. If there's another topic you'd like to see me cover on the channel, please leave that in the comments as well. All of those things really do help the channel, so I appreciate them greatly. Special thanks, as always, to the patrons whose names you can see on screen right now. Their support is what makes the channel possible. And finally, thanks to Marmar for editing this video, a service also made possible thanks to the backing of the patrons and channel members.